welcome to the show. I'm Peter Whittle. Now, over recent weeks, of course, we have been very much caught up with what you might call the superficial issues of politics. But of course, bubbling away under the surface are the major issues, one of which is the fact that it appears that the world has given up having children. I'm very pleased that my guest this week is Dr. Paul Morland. He is one of the world's leading experts on demographics and an author of a number of books, the latest of which is this one, No One Left: Why the World Needs More Children. It's just come out and he's here to talk to me about it. Thank you very much indeed, Paul, for joining us.
Thank you for asking me.
It's a pleasure. This is a huge issue. From what I can see, from the point you make or have made, is that the British particularly don't talk about it. But before we get on to that, can you just sort of give me a few statistics about what we are actually talking about? You know, maybe with relation to one or two countries. What is the problem?
Well, perhaps I can just sort of outline the process first, and then I'll give you some statistics. I always talk about pre-modern, modern, and postmodern demography. Pre-modern is the world that Malthus described. Everybody breeding like rabbits, dying like flies, high fertility, high mortality, because we couldn't control our fertility, we couldn't much control our mortality, and very small population. The population of the world quadrupled over 2,000 years. Right. So you could do that in a generation, and it took 2,000 years, because whilst people were having large families, lots and lots of children died before the age of 1 and so on. And Malthus thought that was how things would always be. Modern demography, that's pre-modern. Modern demography is that process of demographic transition, which some people, I certainly learned about at school, which is, first of all, you get better medicine, you get more food, you get technological progress, and mortality rates come down, the population grows, still having large families, but people are living longer, population expands. Then eventually the fertility rate falls towards 2, and the population then stabilizes at a higher level. So you go from high fertility, high mortality, small population, and by the end of that process, you've got a high population, but low fertility and low mortality, long life expectancy, small families. And that's kind of the end of demographic history, we thought. And that's kind of where Britain was getting by the time of the Second World War. Then we had the baby boom. And countries got through that process at different stages, and we're now seeing much of Africa progressing through it, at least having the mortality come down very fast. We're now in what I call postmodern demography, where most countries, increasing number of countries, see people living to 70 or 80. I mean, Indians, Mexicans, people who would die in their 40s or 50s now live long lives. Yeah. Just a few years short of the US, which is a poor performer among the wealthy countries. And at best people are living till the mid-80s on average in Japan. The big difference is how many children are they having? And it's no longer just a function of how advanced and developed you are. The examples I always give are Israel and South Korea, both highly urban, highly educated and wealthy countries. In Israel, they have 3 children per woman, and in South Korea, 2/3 of a child per woman. So that's not about urbanization, education and prosperity. It's about something deeply cultural. That's why I call it postmodern. It's like we've gone through the modernization process, and when we're out of it, high life expectancy is everywhere. The key thing is what's the difference in the fertility rate. And the one piece of information I would give you, so obviously as people have longer life and their fertility rates fall, they age. And that gives rise to all sorts of problems, which I talk about in the book. But the one piece of data that I'd give you is that Japan was going through a demographic expansion in the 60s, and now its population is falling. And if you look, say, in the 1960s, it reached 100 million. By the 2050s, it will be back to 100 million. So it goes up, it goes down. And some people say, well, what's the problem? It was fine at 100 million, and it will be fine when it gets back to 100 million. When it was going upwards in the 1960s, there were about 8 people of working age in Japan to every retiree. When it goes back down to 100 million, it will be roughly 1 for 1. So think what that means in terms of spend on pensions, spend on healthcare, tax take, innovation, energy in the society and economy. That's why the Prime Minister of Japan has talked about societal collapse.
Can you sort of, you mentioned Israel and Japan and Korea there. What about, say, like a country like Italy? Because that, as I understand it, I remember reading that that was one of the worst examples. Can you take
Italy is a very bad case. The worst cases of, if you say fertility, low fertility is a bad thing, which we can discuss, but I certainly do think it's a bad thing. Italy has had low fertility for a very long time. Now, it hasn't got fertility rates at the Korean level. It's perhaps 1.2 or 1.3. But what makes it problematic for a country is two things: how low the fertility rate is below replacement level, and how long it's been going on for. Now, Korea is the worst in terms of how low it is, but it's a relatively recent phenomenon in Korea. But in the 80s, they were still having a couple of kids per couple. Italy has been very low for a very long time. And in Italy, you can see the effects in terms of rapid aging. You can see the effects in terms of large parts of the country. You see this in Spain as well, effectively being abandoned, villages being abandoned, and whole swathes of the countryside being empty, schools shutting, and very difficult to run a business where you've got a declining population.
Yes. Now, just to be completely clear, replacement is what, 2.1? Is that right?
Well, if you have a third of your children dying in the first year, which is was the case in a lot of places, and now I think the highest in the world, probably Sierra Leone, is about 80 per thousand, so it's gone down a lot. But if you have lots of your kids dying before they get to the fertile years, or before they're through their fertile years, then you need a much higher fertility rate. So it would be 2 if everybody made it all the way through their fertile years. The 2.1, it's probably a bit below 2.1 now, reflects a society where very few people are going to die before they're 40. So take a cohort of children born in year X. By year X plus 40, in a modern developed society, overwhelmingly they're still alive. Now, if that's the case, if they're all making it through, then 2 would do. And actually 2 would be fine, even if you have a slight loss of life and therefore very, very small decline, not quite enough people, 2 would be absolutely fine. 2.1 is a sort of a quick way of remembering you need a little bit more just to replace the people who don't make it through their fertile years.
And where's Britain at the moment?
Well, Britain does not have the lowest infant mortality rate in the world. That's somewhere like Japan, but it's sort of 4 per thousand. So it's so low. Yes, it's double the Japanese level. And yes, it's wonderful we could get it lower, and if our hospitals were better, we could. When I was born in the 60s, by the way, it was about 25 per thousand, and now it's 4 per thousand. So even though we're not the best in the world, we're pretty good. It's so low at that kind of level, well below 1%, that actually, whether we're 2.01 or 2.05, it's kind of irrelevant. I mean, every child matters, and every child that's lost is a tragedy. But whether we're Japan or Britain or Estonia, which is very good, pretty much all the developed world, infant mortality rates are so low, and mortality rates before the age of 40 are so low that we're talking about very small numbers on a theoretical replacement level.
Yes, it always used to be the sort of received wisdom that this was a Western thing, a Western thing, having to. But actually, what your book shows, and in fact from reading as well now, is that it's grown and it's basically spread. There's one big outlier, though, isn't there? And that is Sub-Saharan Africa.
So in a way, Sub-Saharan Africa is not an outlier, because if you think what I said about pre-modern, modern and post-modern, the modernization process is one where, first of all, life expectancy expands and mortality falls, the population expands, and then eventually the fertility rate falls. And it's not that Africa's an outlier in necessarily in that there's something peculiar about it. It's just behind, if you see this as a process which most countries follow, and that there's a debate and a lot of hair splitting among demographers, but I think broadly it is a process that most countries follow, then Sub-Saharan Africa is just behind the rest of the world. Now, actually, it's quite a nuanced picture. So South Africa, which has a long tradition of very effective family planning, going back to the apartheid years, but carried on by the ANC governments, has got its fertility rate down to somewhere sub 3, and its neighbours are now adopting that similarly. So there's a bit of a neighbourhood effect there. So the southern part of the continent is rapidly getting its growth of population under control. There's still a lot of population growth in the system, but the fertility rate is definitely coming down. Some of the big countries in East Africa, particularly Ethiopia, Kenya, and now to an extent Uganda, are getting their fertility rates down. So what happens is you've got a huge cohort of young women, very few older people dying because of the population pyramids like that, and those women are having enough children to replace the small number dying. That's called demographic momentum. The population goes on growing, but you're starting to build into the works a slowing down by reducing your fertility rate, which is why in Britain, for example, we still have more births than deaths every year, just about, even though we've had below replacement fertility since the early 70s. That runs out eventually, but it's just the fact that you've still got larger cohorts of women having children and smaller cohorts dying off. That won't keep the population growing forever. So countries like Kenya and Ethiopia have got decades of population growth ahead of them, but they are significant. They've got their fertility rates down, say from 6 to 4 towards 3. There's a huge swathe of West and Central Africa that has really not started yet on the journey of getting its fertility rate down, but actually quite rudimentary interventions in healthcare, in aid, in food mean that their mortality rates are down. So that's where you're getting enormous population expansion. The other thing I was going to mention is if you go back to the modern, what I call the modern demographic period, if you go back to 1970s, you could tell me a country's GDP per capita or its level of literacy or its urbanization rate, and I could have told you what the fertility rate was. It was a material process. Now we're out of that. What's interesting is not only that you get, as I said, countries like Korea and South Korea and Israel, where the fertility rate's so different and it's not based on material phenomena anymore. But what's also happening is that you're getting quite poor countries, quite undeveloped countries, getting to very low fertility rates. The two examples I always use, but they're not outliers necessarily, are Jamaica and Thailand. Jamaica has a fertility rate of 1.4, well below ours. Thailand 1.3. So you're getting quite poor countries. India is about to go below 2. And large parts of India have fertility rates that are lower than Britain's. So what's interesting is not only that, okay, we have this process, you get richer, you get more urban, you get more developed, and your fertility rate comes down. As the world makes that journey, global fertility rates will come down. But actually, the point at which low fertility hits is moving backwards, if you like. Or to put it another way, countries are getting through their demographic transition more rapidly than their economic development.
You mentioned, about when you were growing up in the 60s and what it was. And I think one of the most startling things, is when you see countries that had traditionally big families until very recently, like Ireland, or in fact, Catholic countries like Italy and also Greece, the whole idea of the big family is now a myth, isn't it? It's just
it is, and it's actually been a myth for longer than people realise. There was a point, probably between maybe the late 70s and 5 or 6 years ago, where Protestant Europe actually had higher fertility rates than Catholic Europe. And Ireland was late to get to low fertility, although it has got there now. But if you accept Ireland, Spain, Italy, Portugal, Orthodox Greece, and much of the Orthodox southeast of Europe has had very low fertility rates for a long time. Some of the better countries in terms of fertility rates, where it was only just below replacement, were the Scandinavian countries. The UK hasn't been that bad until fairly recently. So there was a kind of inversion. Back early in the century, Catholics had larger families, and excepting Ireland, by the later end of the 20th century into the early 21st, it was actually the Protestant countries of Europe that had a higher fertility rate. Now they're coming down too. So I think people's perception of demography tends to lag reality, which is why so many people still think of large Catholic families, and so many people still think the world has got too much population that it's growing too rapidly. And I think they're stuck in the mindset of the population bomb of the 1960s, when the world population was growing twice as fast as it is now and accelerating rather than slowing down.
Well, I mean, that was the kind of climate change of its time, wasn't it, really?
Yeah.
I mean, the green movement, or whatever it would have been called then, very, very strong on population explosion, wasn't it?
Yes.
And but of course that's not really appropriate anymore. The big question about all of this, is why. I mean, you know, people say, depending on your political viewpoint, there's a material reason and there's a cultural reason, maybe, whatever. But I mean, is it too complicated to actually say this is the reason, do you think?
It's too complicated to say this is the reason if by this you mean one thing. Any example people come up with, there always seems to be a counterexample. So I had an interview with one gentleman, one podcaster, who said, oh, it's got to do with alcohol, hasn't it? And I looked at him askance.
Alcohol?
Alcohol. He said, well, we're not drinking enough. And when we used to go out and get drunk and, you know, frolics would follow. So quite a funny thought. But I said to him, I said, Andrew, you know, if that were the case, then some of the lowest fertility rates in the world would be in the Muslim countries where they don't have alcohol. You know, other people will say, oh, it's because we don't have a pride in ourselves, our culture, our past. We don't have a national purpose anymore. And I think that's a very interesting narrative, which, you know, I know many of your guests explore. But if you look at countries which have very great pride in their national traditions, which are still very homogenous culturally and ethically, like Japan and Korea, they've got some of the lowest fertility rates. So it's all about housing, it's all about childcare. Well, yes, we should help people start families and have housing, and I think there are all sorts of things we should do on that score. And we could have a much cheaper childcare. But where you look, that housing is cheap, some parts of the UK, very large parts of Germany, large parts of the Balkans, fertility rates are very low. And where you look at highly subsidised childcare in some of the Baltic countries, again in Germany, fertility rates are low. So I don't think it's a material thing. As we get richer and richer, we find it harder and harder to afford children. That doesn't make sense. Richer countries do still have smaller families than poorer ones, even if some of the poorer ones.
Yeah.
So the material explanation to me seems wrong. So then it's culture. Well, what does culture mean? I mean, is culture a catch-all for everything that isn't easily measured or material? But I do think what we can see, you know, what you can say, whilst wealth and housing costs and childcare costs, important though they are, don't seem to correlate, where you can see a link is in religion, for example. If you look at religious attendance at services or religious belief or self-categorization by religiosity, in many countries, the US, Israel, Spain, France, don't know about the data for the UK. We definitely see that there is a correlation between having more religious commitment or belief or practice on the one hand and a higher fertility rate on the other. So that's definitely something. There is something in some countries there's been an analysis of political views, and it seems that people on the left are more likely to have small families or no families than people on the right. The US is a good case. And there's analysis done of Trump voting counties and Biden voting counties, and it was very clear that the Trump voting counties had more children. Now, some people would say, oh, that determines our political future. Of course it doesn't, because people don't always vote the way their parents vote. So there is something about religious attitudes, something about political attitudes. There is something about the condition of modernity. I think that is the common theme. I mean, modernity is almost as vague a term as culture. But there's something about modernity which tends towards low fertility. And it seems to me that you need a counter-narrative, a counter-culture, if you're going to have the benefits of modernity. I don't want to go back to the 1950s. I don't want anything less than full opportunities for women. I think we need women in the workplace. It's a question about what are the counter-narratives, not going back to the 1950s, but forward to the 2030s. What are the counter-narratives which will allow us to have the benefits of modernity without the very low fertility rates which are dooming our future? Now, I haven't got all the answers, but I think that's a way of perhaps framing the problem.
Yes.
And at my age, you know, I'm almost 60, I'm already a grandfather. I don't think I'm going to be the person to invent that new culture. I think it's got to be a young, new, coming generation that looks at the world around it and says, what do we want from this modernity, and what do we need to junk in order to prioritize having children and carrying our lives, our communities, our families, our nations onward.
You see, you mentioned there, you know, if we want to carry our nations onwards. That's the point, it seems to me, that, I mean, you alluded to it there. is that when people talk about, oh, it's just too expensive, childcare, the tax situation, everything, it's just too expensive to have children. My feeling has always been that, in fact, it's actually that when people have zero real faith in the future, that's when almost subconsciously they stop having children. I mean, there was a great book written by a novel by P.D. James called Children of Men.
Yes,
it's made into a movie.
Yeah. Haven't seen the movie.
Well,
lots of people have seen the movie and not read the book, but I've read the book.
Yeah,
and not seen the movie.
I've done both, and the film's pretty good actually. But it was sort of 1991 she wrote it, and I think it was sort of rather prescient actually, because I mean, the world has stopped having. There's this one woman who gets pregnant.
Yeah.
She sort of said, it's interesting in the book, the way that people first noticed it was that midwives suddenly started having no appointments. They would look at their appointment diary and there'd be nothing in a few months' time and things like that. And it's sort of, you thought, actually, she was onto something there. But
she was, although if I remember correctly, and it's a while since I read the book, it's a biological problem.
Right.
It's actually that people can't have children. So I think
Yes,
it's prescient
it is, yes.
in a way. What sort of society? So fertility means two different things. Fertility rates, for a demographer, means how many children do people have. For whatever reason, if they do or they don't, because they want to, they can't, they delay it. That's what we just mean by, as demographers, how many children people have. For a biologist, fertility is what is people's ability to have children. And those are two different things. So a biological problem could lead to a demographic problem, but the demographic problem could have all sorts of causes. And as things stand at the moment, there's a lot of talk about, again, people come up with biological reasons, but it's the falling sperm count. Now, I'm not a biologist, and I read some papers on this subject. There does seem to be an issue there, but it's not yet the case that a couple at a reasonable age engaging in sexual activity reasonably regularly can't conceive quite fast. It's still the case that most people do. Now that may change. We may get to the P.D. James world of fertility, but we don't actually have it yet. I mean, yes, people are trying later and later, so more people are having problems. But nature's very generous in a sense, and even at much lower sperm count levels than persisted in the past, it's still not difficult for most people to get pregnant reasonably early, or reasonably quickly if they start. If they try by in their early 30s at the latest. So, I suppose that's the difference between what's actually happening and the kind of world that P.D. James talked about.
I think a lot of people, particularly on our side of the my side of the political divide, tend to sort of put it fairly and squarely at the feet of feminism, and that women have changed in the way that they don't want to. That might be too simplistic, but I would say that the general thrust, cultural thrust, has been not one favourable to the family. I mean, that when it's portrayed, the family is portrayed as the sort of, the bedrock of neurosis, for example. Yeah. It's not seen as a good thing, and you sort of see this in the general culture. And plus, surely, our unbelievable rampant individualism, surely, and selfishness. I mean, I was talking to you before we came on, and I think it's in Canada, there was something like 69% of young women said the reason that they didn't want children yet was that, their personal growth was more important to them. Well, you might say, well, so why shouldn't it be? But it's not conducive, is it?
Well, the way the book's organised is, first of all, what's going on, what's the problem, and then I deal with some riposte, some sort of classic answers, and then finally I talk about what we might do about it. Now, the kind of, it's not really a problem, or we shouldn't be worrying about it, or you're wrong. That normally the pushback comes on immigration can fix it, which we may or may not get around to talking about. What about immigrants? What about technology? I don't think AI is the answer either. But there's also what about women? And I had quite a long chapter in there originally. I spent quite a lot of time talking to feminists and researching the history of feminism, interrogating it for its attitudes to childbearing. And the book was criticised in the Times for not spending enough time talking about women. Well, it spends a lot of time talking about women. It doesn't spend that long talking about feminism. That chapter was enormously cut. But what, by my editor, probably rightly, because it was a bit of a sort of exegesis on feminism. It didn't necessarily add to the argument, but there's a long tradition of, just as there is on the left, because people say, oh, this is a far right thing, and I always say, Marx and the Soviet Union and Cuba, all pronatalists. It's not a right-left thing. Macron in the centre is pronatal. Similarly, there's a long tradition, just as there is on the left of pronatalism, there's a long tradition of feminist pronatalism, celebrating this extraordinary power women have to give birth. Mary Wollstonecraft, for example. It was only and lots of feminist thinkers have had quite complex and varied and interesting attitudes to childbearing and attitudes that have changed over time. There was a sort of 1960s, 70s, I think you'd call that second wave feminism, which was quite explicitly anti-natalist. And today there's a sort of new wave of feminism with again, women saying, some thinkers saying that women need to celebrate their childbearing capacities and the uniqueness that they have, or the difference they have over men. There's the fact that, as Miriam Cates has done some work on this, as have others, in most countries, women still say they want 2 to 3 children. So there's the simple fact of what women want, which feminists will happily talk about, but not necessarily in this respect. So I think, again, I don't want to be anti-feminist, and as I've said at many places, many times, my daughters have had the same opportunities as my son. They've had good educations and good careers, but they both had started their families before they were 30. And I think we need to reimagine a world where we have everything a feminist would want in terms of equality, in terms of rights, in terms of women in the workplace, if that's where they want to go. But at the same time, we combine that with 2 to 3 children. I'm not saying 6 or 7 on average, I'm saying 2 to 3 on average. It shouldn't be impossible for women like my mother, for example, who worked all her life, my wife who worked all her life. My mother had 2, my wife's had 3, my daughters who are now working, and one of them's got 1, one of them's got 1, and another one on the way. It shouldn't be impossible for us as a society, as a culture, to find a way to say, yes, it is the woman who's got to do the childbearing, and yes, there are certain biological facts, but how can we combine those with full female emancipation in every department of the state, it just shouldn't be impossible. I think not only is it not impossible, it's absolutely necessary, because we're not going back to the 1950s or the 1850s. So we've got to find a way to combine these things.
I suppose as well that when I was sort of thinking about this, that one doesn't want to lay it entirely at the door of feminists or whatever. But, and I'm going a bit out on a limb here, but if you think in our kind of society, for example, in the West, the Anglosphere, right? If you think, what are the kind of huge liberal kind of articles of faith, broadly speaking, where you stand on abortion, where you stand on gay rights and the kind of, almost I'd say, fetishization of the kind of gay lifestyle. And also increasingly euthanasia. What do they all have in common? They are all sort of anti the species going on, in an odd way, aren't they? They're all anti. They're not about life going on.
Well, maybe you put your finger on something very profound in liberalism.
Yes. I'm talking about liberalism. I'm not obviously not because I'm just using that loosely simply because conservatism has broadly taken all those things on anyway.
Yes. So again, whatever my personal views on abortion, I don't think we will crack this problem. So to get back to practicalities, I think you're sort of thinking about ideology as a right is really interesting. But to be practical, I don't think we'll fix the problem by banning abortion, for example.
No.
Because people will find ways around it. But I don't. Whatever my own views, I don't want to impose them on other people. Of course, there is a question about what the right point is. Could we reform the law? Should it be illegal for people to stand outside? There's a whole range of issues to debate. But I certainly don't want to say, let's ban all abortions. I don't think it would actually help the fertility rate because, number one, people, and it may be a good thing in itself again, but people would work harder at avoidance. People would find ways around it. So I don't think that the route, the highway to a revival of our fertility is through going back to banning abortion.
No.
So again, it's not that I'm necessarily extremely liberal. It's just that I don't think I think we need to find a way forward which incorporates feminism and incorporates liberalism, but says to those ideologies and those ways of thinking, surely that needn't mean that you can't have 2 to 3 children on average per couple.
No, I totally get it. I was just putting those things out there simply, not because I agree with any particular. I mean, I speak as a gay man myself. You know, I mean, so it's not a question of being oppositional to any of that. It's just the way in which they are especially celebrated. That's the thing. That's what tells you a lot. And I can see it happening with euthanasia, actually. It's
well, I'm very
up.
worried about euthanasia. I think the problem is, as I write a lot in the book, the biggest problem, the most immediate problem of this, which you can quantify, is the aging of the population. We have more and more older people, more and more pensions, more and more healthcare, fewer and fewer taxpayers. I gave a talk at the Reform Club, and someone said, "Isn't the answer euthanasia?" And I said, "Well, it's the solution to all these problems that's worse than all the problems." Once now, again, you can talk about assisted dying. What's the pros? What are the cons? I feel very strongly that all this is coming up now precisely because we haven't had enough children, and that this sort of ideological shift towards pro-euthanasia is built on a material substructure of demography, if you like. And I'm very worried that once you lose the respect for the sanctity of life, then all sorts of things, all sorts of unintended consequences will follow. And whilst ideally, maybe in extremis, it would be better if certain people who are suffering, who might live another 2 or 3 weeks, you could save them those 2 or 3 weeks of suffering. I wonder if that isn't the price to keep the dignity of human life. And once you go, it could be a very, very slippery slope. Yes. So again, I don't really talk about euthanasia in the book. It's not really my subject. But I wonder and I fear that if we lose the value, if we stop valuing young life by not having children, the ultimate consequence will be that we lose our respect for the value of life altogether.
Oh, yes. If you take Britain at the moment, let's go back to Britain. We've just had an election, which manages, on the whole, to basically avoid anything of any real sort of seriousness facing us, of which this is one. Would you say, therefore, that one of the reasons for this mass migration that's been, particularly over the past 20 years, is due to this? I mean, is it a response to
immigration?
Yeah.
Well, I wrote a paper for the ARC conference, I think I was mentioning to you, in the autumn. In my last book, Tomorrow's People, I talk about the trilemma. So effectively, you can have 2 of 3 things. You can have a buoyant economy, you can have a low birth rate, and you can have low immigration and ethnic continuity, if you like, and homogeneity. You can't have all 3. The examples I give are Japan, which hugely prizes its ethnic homogeneity, doesn't want immigration, doesn't want to have children, and as a result, you and I probably remember when Japan was the land of the rising sun. Everything was going to be Japanese, and it's impossible that it could have carried on, given that it's now it's had decades of a falling workforce, and it's now got a falling population. So they've effectively said, yes, we'll have the small families, and yes, we'll have the ethnic continuity, and we'll give up the economic growth. In Britain, we're trying to keep the lights on, we're trying to keep the economy growing. And at the same time, we're not having Japanese-style families, we're having very small families, not enough children. And we're effectively bringing immigrants in as a stopgap solution. And I think it is only a temporary solution for reasons we may be able to explore.
It's a Ponzi scheme, isn't it?
It is a Ponzi scheme. The immigrants have small families in turn. It's giving rise to a backlash, which we're seeing everywhere from Trump to the AfD to Le Pen. And whether you like it or not, people have votes and we live in democracy. So
no, but what I mean is that these immigrants are going to get
absolutely.
old.
So point 1 is we can't just ship ever more people in.
Yes.
And because they grow old. Point 2 is there's a backlash. Point 3 is should we be bringing people like medical staff in from Ghana because we're too busy and important to have our own when we have much better healthcare than they have in Ghana. So a whole set of reasons. But nevertheless, that's the route that Britain's chosen. And only Israel's chosen to have a high fertility rate, which means it doesn't need mass immigration. So the ARC paper, Philip Pilkington, an economist, and I actually quantified these things. And we said, given that the immigrants have low birth rate, the only minority group whose numbers went down in the last census was the Afro-Caribbeans. They have a high intermarriage, high assimilation, low birth rate, and so on. So given all what we know about immigrant fertility rates, domestic fertility, how much immigration do we need? And as you said, that doesn't really work. It's just a Ponzi scheme with an ever-aging population and huger wedges of people coming in to support it. We're used to having Irish immigrants and Polish immigrants, for example. They're now both quite low fertility countries, wealthy countries. We can't rely on them anymore. Only countries with quite low productivity are having so a whole range of reasons why that's not the long-term solution. But we actually quantified it. Equally, we said, well, if you want to stop immigration today, or pretty much stop it, but at the same time you didn't revive your birth rate, how bad would those support ratios go? How long before we go from 3 workers per retiree to 2 workers per retiree to 1 worker? And that the whole welfare system will collapse. The whole state financing will collapse. So that's also not a real solution. So there's a trade-off, and I don't think the immigration, endless mass immigration, or the endlessly aging population are actually sustainable. The only sustainable future for a state, for a country, for a nation, is to sustain itself by having a fertility rate of 2 to 3.
With the way the scenario that you described there. There's another point to this, isn't it? That essentially, it's not. You said homogeneity or whatever, and basically a prosperous economy. You can't have, all 3. But when you have an immigrant population that comes in to a country like Britain, which has a much higher fertility rate, so I believe that in schools now in London, it's something like 64% ethnic minority children, something like that.
Yes.
But in terms of births happening in our hospitals, that is going to change the culture hugely, is it not?
Yeah, of course.
I mean, forget about the Ponzi scheme aspect of it. There's this too.
But the thing to bear in mind is that immigrant fertility rates fall towards the native level. They do. Right. And so, for example, as I've said, Afro-Caribbean fertility rates are probably lower than average. Hindu and Sikh fertility rates are not great data on this, but appear to be lower than average, or at least no higher than the white British. Those who I always have to say in the census there's the white British category, because otherwise just using the term white British can get you into trouble. But that is a category, and the fertility rates and that of Muslims seems to be coming down quite rapidly. In the United States, when mass immigration from Mexico began in the 70s, the average Mexican woman in Mexico had, I think, 3, 4, possibly 5 children more than the average American woman. Now Mexico has a fertility rate barely higher than America's. And one of the big things that's been driving down the fertility rate in the States has been the fall of the Latino fertility rate towards the... So in our societies, all the communities tend to move towards a low fertility rate. The reason that London schools are overwhelmingly or majority non-white British is because of mass immigration. And there's a compounding effect as the immigrant fertility rate is higher, but that's not what's really driving the ethnic change. And if today you said no more immigration, for example, which I don't think is realistic, but if you did, the further ethnic change driven by differential fertility rates would, I think, be fairly modest. Compared to 1 million people arriving every year, it's really about migration, because at the same time as you've got a slightly higher fertility rate converging on the national level, but still providing a bit, they're a younger population, they have the demographic momentum we talked about. There's also a lot of assimilation, there's a lot of intermarriage going on. So it's really the level of immigration rather than differential fertility rates that is driving ethnic change.
What do you put forward broadly, Paul, in your book as to how we can basically deal with this? What is a solution might be the, maybe you're not offering that, but what should we do?
Well, I offer it with a degree of humility, I hope, because I don't have all the answers. I don't think anyone has at this stage. The first thing I would say is that we're not even talking about it yet. So we have never had a government. We've never had a government minister. In Britain. So if you start talking about it, you're shouted down, you're told you're far right, you're told you're anti-feminist and so on. Again, it's not the case. It's been a left, centre and right issue. People like Macron, many writers on the left, thinkers on the left, have been pronatal. So we need to get over this, it's a far right thing. Second thing is we need to start talking about it.
To interrupt you there for a minute, you've used the term pronatalism a lot. Can you just explain what you mean by that?
I mean nothing more than saying having families is a good thing, having children is a good thing in itself. I mean, I talk a lot about support ratios in economics. Ultimately, it's because people want to have children, because they're hugely... it's a wonderful adventure to become a parent. It's something that I would recommend to anyone. It's the most important thing in your life, if it's something you can do and you wish to do. So it's a predisposition to liking children and liking families. It is a predisposition towards that, but it's also a belief in all the economic problems that happen and cultural and social problems if you don't. So that's what I mean by pronatalism. So the first thing is to start talking about it, not just brave backbenchers like Miriam Cates. When are we going to hear ministers talking about it? 50 years we've had below replacement fertility, and yet nobody talks about it. In Britain, they did in Australia, they got the baby bonus 20 years ago. They do in France. They have pronatal policies in lots of European countries like Spain and Estonia. It's a peculiarly British thing that we won't talk about it. So
Hungary too.
Hungary, yes, but Hungary, of course, fits the it's a right-wing issue. So but Hungary and lots. It's not just Hungary. I think that's my point. Not just the Urbanistas, if you like, of this world. It's quite moderate, middle of the road people like Macron as well. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we need to start experimenting on policies to change it. I think policy can only go so far. But we need radically to change the way we do housing in this country. This government has actually helped on childcare somewhat. That is important. But I think above all, we need a cultural shift. Now, the question is, where is culture relative to politics? And I always used to say, like everybody else, without thinking about it, the politics is downstream in culture. But as my friend Philip Pilkington pointed out to me, why do you say that? It sort of made me think about it. Philip Pilkington, who I've written this ARC paper with and writing another paper, politics can shift culture. And the examples would be reform of homosexuality in the 60s, the ending of the death penalty in the 60s. These were things where the politicians took a stance and the population took a long time to come round. The culture shifted, but actually politics was upstream. So I think it would be good if our politicians acknowledged an issue and started to think about the cultural changes which could move the dial. I mean, one thing would be telling people at school, this is the shape of your fertility, your biological fertility over time, and how it starts to trail off in your 30s. I think if people knew that, they might, I mean, that's just one idea. They might they might actually model their lives in a way. How can we have a world in which we get education to the level we have it, but people actually have children a bit earlier? Do we have to do this? I do school, then I do university, then I get a job, then I get to a certain level at some point. Could we be more creative in how we structure the lives of young people so that they can have children at a younger age without damaging their material and career prospects? So there are a whole range of things, and I don't think I have all the answers by any means. What I'm trying to do is get the conversation going, stop people being scared to talk about it, encourage government to start thinking about it and propose policies. One policy I mentioned in a Sunday Times article a few years ago was, wouldn't it be nice to give tax breaks to parents? Now, everyone goes to the Chancellor with their own idea, and I would be the 55th person in the line. So maybe we just need to have something that's fiscally neutral, that raises taxes for people without children and lowers it for those with. That's very normal. Lots of countries have that. France has it, Cuba has it. So it's not a right-wing thing. but we could do it in a fiscally neutral way if we needed to. And we have a benefit system that recognises children. So could we change the tax system somewhat? So I think we have to experiment. We have to try things out. We have to see what best practice is in foreign countries, what the Hungarians have tried, what the Australians have tried. Why is Israel such a high fertility country despite all its other correlates? We have to start acknowledging the problem and starting to be creative about solving it. You won't find all the answers in that book, but I think the conversation needs to move on.
Absolutely. I think it's in Hungary, actually, yes, they've had limited success with this, I think.
It's interesting that they've had a huge rise in the marriage rate,
right,
but not yet a huge rise in the fertility rate.
Right.
So we'll see what follows.
And I think the other thing as well, surely, I think you've actually we covered it pretty much, but when you want to talk about it, as you say, when you want to have the conversation, it often does seem that there are, as women economists or commentators or whatever, who immediately sort of start thinking the Handmaid's Tale, you know what I mean, and all of this stuff. And that basically it's it's up to this all comes down to women. Actually, it doesn't just come down to women at all, does it? I mean, it's men too wanting children.
Well, again, I roll my eyes every time. I actually enjoyed The Handmaid's Tale. I probably read it 30 years ago. It's a good novel. Well, it's a bit of it's strange in certain ways. Not really the right point to go into, but. My first two reviews of this book were in the FT and the Times. And the FT was very positive about it, which I was really pleased about. And what disappointed me about the Times review was it's like, what about women? It's women's bodies. And it's just, of course it's women's bodies. He only has one short chapter on women. No, one short chapter on feminism. The whole thing has got to be about men and women, about couples, about responsibility, about imagining an equal future in which we have children, and this sort of Gilead, Handmaid's Tale. It's become a very boring response, to be honest. Yes. If that's all there is to say about it, what about women? Right? What about women on the front of the book and throw it away? We've got to think, of course, about how we can combine. And I say this till I'm blue in the face. How can we combine having enough children to replace ourselves with the fact that women are as intelligent, as keen to get educated, as keen to go in the workplace as men, and there's no going back on that. And I'm very pleased there's no going back on that. So can we just get over that and start talking about how we solve the problem, rather than harping on as if I'm just saying we need to go back to the 1950s and get the women back in the bedroom and the kitchen. It's boring.
Well, look, you've started a conversation anyway with this, Paul. No One Left by Paul Morland. It's in bookshops, isn't it? As well as on Amazon and everything, yeah. We have a few questions for you for our members, exclusive material for them. But in the meantime, thank you very much, Paul, for coming on talking about the book. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's it for this week, and we shall see you next time. In the meantime, do have a good week, won't you? Bye-bye.
Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.